Right, also.
You're all here? Welcome, everybody. Welcome to you people too. Michael David Fox has done us the honor of visiting us to talk to us about his most recent book, the most recent among quite a few. I think the count is 15 monographs and edited volumes. Is that right?
I think so,
Yeah.
but who's counting, right?
Well, Stakhanovism, right? And I won't go too much into his biography. Suffice to say that Misha was part of that wave of historians who made it into the archives as soon as they opened in that fateful year of 1991. And he's continued to work in Russia ever since, but also all parts of the former Soviet Union. Russia right now is problematic, as it is for all of us. And if I were to try to describe his general approach to matters, it would be that he's, very much a student of and someone who respects the archives and the sources, on the one hand, and on the other hand, somebody who's always tried to push the quite narrow Soviet field into something somehow bigger, either by methodology or by, very often in Misha's case, comparison. When he's come to us with us now is curiously also comparative, even though it's only talking about one small region of what was the Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union. But it's a very, very significant region. Will you go into the history of the writings about Smolensk?
A little bit.
Little
I'll
bit.
go into Feindsaw for sure.
Okay, well, that's the starting point here, which was that there was this archive, which was captured by the Wehrmacht, which gave historians outside of the Soviet Union their first view about the inner workings of the system. And that was well studied by, to begin with, Meryl Feindsaw, who you'll talk to us about, a famous Cold Warrior, and was part of the inauguration of what we call Soviet studies and area studies during the Cold War period. And so what Misha has done is, if you see from the title, he's looking at it not only under Soviet rule, which was Feindsaw's concern, but also under Nazi rule, because there are a series of back and forths in his territory. And what he's tracing is obviously how individuals and groups react to these changes, with some surprising results, I think, and but also a comparison of occupation and violence, which has been on the minds of quite a few people recently, and I think Misha's take will be somewhat different. I'll leave it at that. Virtual people, I'll turn to you at the very end. You can make yourselves known, and we'll go back and forth between you and the live audience. So thank you, Misha.
Okay,
please.
thank you so much, Yanni. And I do remember 1991 very well because you also were there and actually shared a flat on Kiev Prospect for a time until we were kicked out in the middle of the year. But that's a digression. I just want to say thank you all for coming. I want to start with maps, not because geography is destiny necessarily, but because even those of you who know where Smolensk is, that is to say the city of Smolensk, likely do not know the Smolensk that I was studying, the Smolensk region, because it shifted most radically precisely in the years that I was studying it, the 2 decades after 1917. So basically what this map shows is the radical transformations of the administration and territory of Smolensk region after 1917. If you look at the darkest part of this map, it is basically what the Smolensk Oblast or region is today in the Russian Federation, the westernmost part of the Russian Federation, but also was after 1944 when it was re-Sovietized after the German occupation. The region that I was studying most intensively included the darkest part and the second darkest part, which was basically the Smolensk region from 1937 to 1941. But this entire map, this giant Western Oblast, and let me just say, even the smallest part of this map, the darkest part, is still in square kilometers, roughly twice the size of Belgium and about half the size of South Korea, as I told people in a recent talk in Seoul. So it's not tiny geographically, but it's a very rural and sparsely populated region. The post-37 borders had about 2.3 million people, and this giant Western Oblast, which was created in 1929 and disbanded in 1937, included about 6 million people. So just think about those 2 years, 1929, the year of Stalin's Great Break, in 1937, the year of the Great Terror. I'm going to bracket that for now in explaining how and why the power and territory and cadres changed so drastically in those 2 years. But for now, I just want to say that I worked with a great historical cartographer in making this map. And when she was working with it, working with me to put it together, it was a rather odd circumstance that we were unable to find more than 2 extant maps of this Western Oblast that existed only in the 1930s. One was an old Soviet map, and it wasn't particularly great. Ironically, the best extant map was on the inside cover of Merle Feinsad's Smolensk under Soviet rule, which was a foundational work published in 1958. And it was foundational, as Yanni was saying, for US and Western Soviet studies, but also Feinsod was the very first, well, scholar. He wasn't the first person, because the documents of the Smolensk captured Smolensk archive were worked over intensively by US security services between 45 and the early 50s when they were declassified. But he was the first scholar to work on them, and it became studied by several generations of Soviet historians. And so therefore, doing this study was kind of doing almost an archaeology of the history of the field in one respect, in that respect. And you can see from this table of contents that I begin the prologue with the Odyssey of the Smolensk archive, which was captured in 41, but in a way it was left behind by the Soviets in part because of, as I explain in the book, a series of, it has to be explained through the nature of the Stalin period, the fact that it was left behind in the first place, and it was so, because it had been, the archivists had been purged and changed constantly in the 30s, and in fact, they just fled when the Germans were about to arrive. But a portion, it was heading west, and was most of it was recaptured by the Soviets in a train car outside of Auschwitz. But one fragment of that archive, roughly 2% of the total, made it west and ended up in Munich and then Frankfurt, where it was basically illegally seized by the Americans and transported to the US. So to sum it up, just to give you a sense of what this structure and design of the book was, you can see that after going into the history of the Smolensk archive, I have 3 pre-war chapters. One is on the so-called Smolensk affair, which is the beginning of the Stalin period and the Stalin revolution. And 2 pre-war chapters, one on collectivization and one on the Great Terror. So it's a political history of the focusing on major turning points within the Stalin revolution. Then I have 1 chapter on the period of power vacuum, or Bezvlastya, in 1941, when the 2 regimes didn't really exist, but there was it's almost like a laboratory for studying power relations when things are in flux like that. And then I have 4 chapters on the German occupation, thematic chapters. And then I have the last chapter on the re-Sovietization of the region in 1943, 44, looking a little bit into the future. And I trace about 10, 12 lives throughout, and the last epilogue is the post-war history of those people that I've traced throughout the book. So to sum it up, this book was my attempt to write what I call an entangled history. So instead of looking at Stalinism alone or German occupation and National Socialism or World War II on the Eastern Front alone, and those have been largely separate fields, or the Holocaust alone, which has also been constituted as a separate field. And there, in recent years, there have been some interconnections more and more among those three fields, but they still remain less well connected, than they should be. And so that was my attempt to kind of leverage insights from all three fields, also by juxtaposing the literatures from those three fields. And each chapter includes both, even the earliest pre-war chapters include a German as well as a Soviet side. Now, the master theme of the book concerns power and power relations. And so I want to say just at the outset, because I've been giving a number of these talks and it's often come up, that I don't use the word totalitarianism, I think, once in the book. The copy editors wrote it on the back cover and various blurbs did, but it's not my own framework for analysis. And I want to make clear that I don't necessarily reject it in all contexts, in the sense that I believe that the word exists and will probably always exist merely because some regimes are more than run-of-the-mill authoritarianisms, and especially these two ones. However, totalitarianism comes attached to it in both its philosophical and its social scientific or political science and its historical kind of paradigms. There were complicated schema in each of those areas attached to it, and all of them presupposed a kind of top-down, highly centralized theory of power centered in Moscow and Berlin. Now, the debate over Nazism and Stalinism is one of the major intellectual scholarly debates of the 20th century. And, but its dominant mode was global overall comparisons, not interactions and entanglements and the way both regimes shaped experiences and power relations on a more local and regional level. And of course, looking at a very rural region that played a very different role in both regimes, it was not a place where I could even ground overall comparisons. But for me, Smolensk, which had two regime changes in 3 years, 41 and 43, was first and foremost a kind of complicated contact zone between institutions, ideas, and people. And regime changes, especially in dictatorial regimes, when the lid suddenly comes off, in my view, become a kind of laboratory for the study of power and power relations. So it's a kind of moment of truth, if you want. But how then to write a book about power? And it's interesting that this, you refer to Sovietska vlast, Soviet power is the very name of the regime. Power is a theme in almost every book ever written on the Soviet period in one way or another. But it's rather startling to see how very few books actually make the topic of power into their central interpretive focus. And power is not, there are various ways of approaching it. But I actually start from the point that it's kind of the Sphinx's riddle of all human and social sciences to actually get to the question of what it is. My main goal was actually to convey a granular description of power, that it's multifarious, that it can be fractured, and especially in the context of these two regimes, it was by intent and I think design, by necessity, improvised and appropriated at the local level. And that was in part, and this is, I can get into this in the Q&A perhaps. I'm not going to be able to talk about it now, but the framework that I think is rather the original part of the framework for talking about these two regimes is that they are intersecting there's a revolutions of the far right and of the left. And so I treat National Socialism as a revolution of the right, as the Nazis thought of themselves. And revolutions come in stages and phases and trajectories. And that's what the study of comparative revolutions shows. But when they clashed at their moment of greatest conflict in 41 on the Eastern Front, they were in very different points, those in the life cycles. So that's kind of the background framework. In terms of power, I treat power, even in these most murderous regimes, as not just hard power, coercion, repression, violence, military might, etc., but also even in those regimes had a whole array of what you might call soft power, belief, language, economic incentives, knowledge, propaganda, ideology. So power operates in many different levels and dimensions. And as I say, well, that's not exactly novel. It comes out of, the Foucauldian revolution in study of power, the post-structuralist, basically, theory that power operates in many, many of these different dimensions. But I do something, I think, more than that. I look at how power was appropriated by local agents and actors who worked to seize in the cataclysms of regime change a slice of power. I call it actually micro doses of power. So a lot of reviewers have picked up on that. But and in the words of Jan Gross, this appropriation at the very local level is what made those regimes so fearsome, in fact. And also I do another thing, which is I actually look at state power as a serious problem of analysis. So I look at the two powerful states, their ideologies, and the central levels of power in Moscow and Berlin, and I try to keep them centrally in focus. But I also have a kind of theory about how the levels of power operated in both regimes. So to get back to what I started with 1929 and 1937, in both those moments of kind of revolutionary revivalism in the Stalin Revolution, the central level of power incited the local levels, mainly the district level, against the regional level of power. And that's exactly what happened in both those years. And so it was a kind of formula for understanding Stalinism as a kind of system of power. More than that, Smolensk was a place far from Moscow in the sense that it was a largely rural world with a few cities that were very far removed from the world of Moscow. But if you go on a train from Smolensk to Moscow today, it's only 4.5 hours. So geographically, actually, it was fairly proximate. And I think that played a role both under Stalinism and also in World War II, being so close to the front lines and to the Soviet side. But in the 1930s, for example, it served both in the Smolensk affair, which is the chapter 1, which was essentially a model of the Smolensk affair was a purge of the party and state apparatus, which launched the Stalin Revolution in especially rural areas. So it was the analog of the Shakti affair in industry. It served as a signal to the entire country, but for those who were opposing or potentially opposing the collectivization drive. And in the 37, 38 as well, during the Great Terror, there were some episodes where I think Smolensk, because it was fairly close to Moscow, served as a kind of all-union precedent in several respects. So my book discards the simple dichotomy of center-periphery relations, which has been kind of dominant in Soviet studies. And it shows that scrambling the levels of power, specifically using the power of the center to mobilize local forces against entrenched regional, but also sometimes district levels, were central to the Great Terror and to the Stalin Revolution. Now, levels of power and space and territory and administration were also really important for the Germans as they occupied this region during World War II. And if you see here, this line going straight through Smolensk is essentially the path of the Minsk-Moscow highway that was built in 1936 by Gulag forced labor. There was actually a traveling Gulag camp that built this road. And the invasion route made certain things about Smolensk kind of distinctive as well. This yellow area marked, it wasn't important for the Germans, but that was the pre-37 to 41 region that I was studying before 41. Army Group Center, which was going along this route, heading towards Moscow, which also had, after August, September 41, had its headquarters in the city of Smolensk, was in charge of the regions near the front lines, as opposed to the warlords in the Reich commissariats in, say, Belarus, Ukraine, or the Baltics. So essentially, there was this kind of fateful, what's that? It happens. So, fateful feedback loop between Berlin and the local Einsatzgruppen who were starting the so-called Holocaust by bullets. And there was a kind of escalatory dynamic going on. That was central, I think, that feedback loop more generally to the German occupation. And also because of its role, the fact that the intent was to take Moscow and radically purge it, which never happened. You can see the line of occupation goes right outside of Moscow, of course, and in late 41, the Germans were stalled. But the German Army Group Center, which was headquartered in Smolensk, had over 40% of the divisions on the occupied territories and over half the tanks. And during the sheer concentration of Wehrmacht leadership and SS leadership in this area was due to its proximity of Smolensk to Moscow and that road. Well, I'll say one other thing right now, which is that without massive help by armed and unarmed collaborators, this German occupation regime could not have functioned. It simply could not have been capable of prosecuting the war at the front and holding its massive Soviet territories, which included, if you look at all the occupied territories, from north to south, this includes 68.4 million people, which is over 40% of the pre-war Soviet population. So to sum it up before I move on, unlike many books that do look at both sides, let's say Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, which is a sweeping synthesis, my book is looking for the place where the local and the regional meet the grand narrative. And the book's second major theme, in addition to power and power relations, involves decision-making by a range of people in extreme conditions, in the age of extremes, put it that way. And the vehicle for exploring this is, as I said before, is the biographical element where I trace people's lives throughout. And along with power, which is such a crucial question, the question of agency, I think, is emerging and has emerged as one of the most important problems of interpretation. Too often we just think of, we assign agency to any group that we are writing about to simply show that they were important and had influence. But of course, you can't study agency without studying structure or constraints. And that was kind of my attempt to study them both together, that how does agency work when structural constraints routinely include things like the number of calories consumed amid starvation or near starvation conditions, when survival itself becomes an everyday feature of choice, when perpetrators could often become victims and victims become perpetrators, depending on the situational agency that was available to them. And powerless people could then become powerful in another situation, for example, after the two regime changes. So people always make decisions in one way or another, even when they include what Holocaust scholars call choiceless choice, when there's no good, where all the available options are simply horrible, people still choiceless choice. That's a phrase out of Lawrence Ledger, who became widely adopted for the death camps. The people I'm studying had significantly more. I also studied the Jewish population of Smolensk, which was significant. It was outside the pale of settlement, but there was, especially in eastern Smolensk, many ghettos and a significant Jewish population. It was only, it was negligible percent of the population, but in terms of urban life, it was quite significant. So choiceless choice, I also use the phrase tragic agency, which is, or compelled agency, which the sociologist Jeffrey Haas used in his book on the Leningrad blockade. But in any case, today I'm going to talk about just 3 of the characters in the book to give you a taste for how what I call biographical logics illuminates questions of power and agency. And this is a slide seated at the desk of one of those main figures, Boris Menshagin, who became the occupation era mayor or burgomeister of Smolensk for over 2 years. And in general, I just feel that, studying the regimes or the systems alone doesn't get you into understandings of Stalinism and Nazism completely, because it can't capture the power dynamics that are manifest in the lives of local and regional actors. So power also means power among people, and it is those locals who saw in cataclysm an opportunity to seize a slice of power that, as I said, both regimes actually required. Menshagin is a little bit unusual in both regimes, and that's why he was such a fascinating character for me, that his behavior under Stalinism, when he was a defense prosecutor, he was a defense lawyer during the local show trials during the Great Terror. So he was a lawyer who became part of the regional procuracy in the 30s and served as a defense attorney during the terror. And though his activities then actually bear an uncanny resemblance to his activities under the German occupation, in the sense that he did something very unusual during the terror. He went out of his way to save a number of people who were put on trial on the local show trials. These were actually veterinarians who had been accused of infecting cattle with a Western capitalist, disease, and the specialists, largely from Moscow, the specialists were put on trial. And in the years of the terror especially, defense prosecutors often went beyond the call of duty and actually demanded, more harsh punishment than the prosecution. And that drove the head procurator, Wyszynski, crazy, because they needed the facade of a functioning legal system, that law was actually an important instrument of the regime. And Minshagin, what he did was he didn't defend them openly at the show trial, but he just called for more evidence. And he actually, we have the documentation for this as well as his own memoirs, but he actually traveled to Moscow, met with Wyszynski. Wyszynski sent a telegram stopping the execution. And then after the Great Terror was ended, and a lot of these cases were reconsidered, they did get let off, these specialists. And this made him something of a local hero in Smolensk, which the Germans capitalized on when they made him mayor. But he was a technocrat, not an ideologue. And in all matters, great and small, he outwardly submitted himself, but first to the Soviet system, where he played a role that his training allowed him to do, but also as mayor under German occupation, where he also saved a number of Jewish people, a number of POWs, a number of people who were former communists, while outwardly subordinating himself to the Germans in almost every respect. But he also maintained that he, was more ethical, more cultured than all these venal opportunists around him. And both positions gave him a status and a power, an element of power, especially under the German occupation, where when looking up, he was completely subordinate to even the lowest German officer, but looking down, he had almost complete control over the local civilian population, where he wielded the power of life and death in near starvation conditions. So Menshagin illustrates a key phenomenon in my book that I call biographical logics. And here I would say just simply that human decision-making is studied across disciplines. I mean, neuroscientists study it, economists study it, rational choice theorists study it. What do historians bring to the table? Well, in my view, we can study the entire life trajectory. So we actually know the trajectory. Can't put people on the couch, but we know what happens at key turning points. And we know what the turning, we can interpret what the key turning points are, what the path dependencies are. And secondly, we can intensively, retrospectively investigate context that shapes those turning points. And so I think that was what I was trying to do, was text, but also context. And in terms of texts, Menshagin left pretty much the only significant autobiographical account of any major mayor under German occupation. And it has a very lengthy history that I can only allude to here. This book is over 800 pages long. So my own book was small compared to this one, but I took part in the editorial team that worked on this annotated documentary. And basically, Menshagin had a phenomenal memory, almost unbelievable. And we've, found dates and names. Sometimes he makes a mistake, but there are hundreds of sources that corroborate much of the material that is in here about the occupation regime, except he was sitting in prison for 25 years. He was recaptured outside of Prague by the Soviets. He was brought to the Lubyanka and then sent to a special prison in Vladimir, where his cellmate, by the way, was Pavel Sudoplatov, the head of the fourth directorate of the NKVD during the war, because they didn't trust anyone else. They knew they would hate each other, and they didn't trust. Most of the 25 years, actually, he was in solitary confinement because he had witnessed the Katyn massacre, the German discovery of the 1940 Katyn massacre. Perhaps one reason he was kept alive and not executed, we don't really know, but he kept notebooks in prison for, and partly it was his strategy during the thaw to try to get himself released by saying, I didn't have anything to do with the ghetto or the psychiatric hospitals or the gypsies, but then trying to sort of bolster his veracity by being as factual as possible about everything else and dissimulating on the big points. So that's how I interpret at least his narrative strategy. But the point is that when he was let out in 1971, the KGB didn't allow him to take those notebooks, but he had met some dissidents in prison who were interested in what he could say about the Stalinist legal system. And they took him to a dacha where he recreated the memoirs on cassette tapes that were smuggled out to Germany. So just to sum it up on Menshagin, that past choices bias future decisions. And for so many of the figures in my book, the experiences under the Stalin period conditioned their choices after the Germans arrived. And I think ultimately Menshagin justified, perhaps even to himself, serving Berlin in precisely the same moralistic terms that he justified serving Moscow. In both positions, he had a position of public local prominence that required technical skills that he possessed. In both cases, he sometimes saved victims, but also acquired status and authority, that is to say, power. This is a second figure who, unlike Menshagin, took the opposite tack under German occupation. This is Lyudmila Madzyuk. This is the only photo that I was ever able to find, and this is from her as a school child in an elite Moscow school in the 30s. And as this suggests, she was a quintessential member of the Stalin generation that had never experienced life before the revolution. She's wearing her pioneer tie. She became a member of the Komsomol as soon as the Germans invaded. She couldn't fight in the army, but she trained quickly as a nurse and went with the Red Army to the front. She was captured in encirclement. She tried to escape several times and failed. And she teamed up with another Komsomolka named Asya Schneiderman, who's another figure in my book who's Jewish. Everyone else was avoiding her because they knew she was Jewish. Lucia, as she was known, Madzyuk, befriended her. They ended up being taken to a Dulag, which is a Durchgang lager. I'm going to talk about these at the very end of the talk in a few minutes. But the POW camps. And at a certain point early in the war, they let out non-combatants, women and children. She was given papers and to live in Smolensk city. And remarkably, Asya Schneiderman was able to conceal her Jewish identity. And they were living in the city of Smolensk when it was completely sealed off in 42 and late 41, 42, 43. They founded the first underground Communist Party cell operating inside the city. She also knew some German. She was able to propagandize Wehrmacht soldiers in the canteens where she worked. Remarkably, she and a former communist Wehrmacht soldier named Leo were studying the second volume of Marx's Kapital in the occupied Smolensk. So this image of Leo, the Wehrmacht soldier, and Lucia, the Komsomolka, studying Marx in occupied Smolensk, to me, epitomizes the kind of strange conditions in this kind of cross-cultural encounter, which did occur even amidst all the war and violence. And I should say that Madzyuk left us some of the most interesting first-person qualitative accounts of an almost taboo topic, which is the widespread sexual relations, both coerced, semi-coerced, and voluntary between Russian women in occupied Smolensk. The civilian population was largely women, children, and older men. So between Russian women and German men. But what does Madzyuk's case say about, and I have a whole chapter on that question. What does Madzyuk's case say about biographical logics? Well, she hated the fact that the Germans thought she could never become an aviation engineer, which is what she was studying. Of course, the gender orders under the two regime, one of the more radical differences among the two ideologies. And, they would say to her things like, oh, you're really smart. You could, German, you could be a secretary if you came to Berlin. And she actually, after the war, realized her ambition to, as a professional woman. She actually became an applied chemist, whose qualifications put her in a position of professional authority. But she achieved that dream far from Moscow because her father was apparently purged, and she and her brother, who's also here holding the paper airplane, they settled in the far north in Ukhta, in the Komi Republic, where she became head of the chemistry department in the district energy directorate. So in other words, just as pre-war experiences shaped the wartime experiences shaped the post-war trajectories. And Lyudmila Madzyuk died in 2002 at the age of 81. Now the third case, and my final case here, I don't actually have a photograph of this person because he was a peasant and living in a very rural region. His name was Vasily Maslenikov, who chronicled after the war. It's a very rare account by a literate peasant, someone who became very literate to the point where he was actually tried to become a history teacher. And moved out of the village. But he eventually wrote post-war memoirs, spent the post-war decades, and these memoirs were never published. And I think it's important that he never wrote them for publication or public consumption in the time that he wrote them. But it was about the mind-boggling changes of a single village over the course of this rockiest period of the 20th century, which is extremely rare. So if Menshagin collaborated and Madzyuk resisted in complicated ways in both cases, Maslenikov actually was in between. He was very cautious by nature. He was buffeted by events. And his most precious asset was that he had taught himself to read, largely by accident. His father was working in Moscow as a stable hand at the Corps de Cadet when it was bombed during the revolutionary unrest of 1917. But at the age of 6, Maslenikov was getting scraps of newspaper. He and his sister were teaching themselves to read, essentially. So when they traveled back to the village after their food supply was destroyed in the Battle of Moscow, the street fighting in Moscow, he grew up in this village as one of the only literate people about an hour from the city of Smolensk, and he was constantly trying to get out of the village. And he's spent like almost 2 decades cobbling together an education that would help him get out of the village, and kept failing for various reasons. But the only way that he could find to get out of the village and escape the collective farm was to actually join the party and to join the collectivizers. But he was always a little bit ambivalent about it, but he also writes about the collective farm system. He writes about the terror. And finally, right before the 41, he gets out of his native village. He goes to a small town on the border with Belarus. And at that moment, the Germans invade, and he has to go back to his home village. So Maslennikov's observations about the agrarian population shows that they were downtrodden and distant from the centers of power, but because of their sheer numbers, they were decisive to both Stalinism and the German occupation. And he was an exceptional figure, as I say, but he exemplifies the role of contingency during so many of the upheavals of the 30s and 40s. People of virtually the same backgrounds were judged in opposite ways politically because of some element of pure chance determined their formal relationships between Soviet and German power. This is just briefly that Maslenikov had 2 siblings. They were both from not only the same village, but the same family. They had similar trajectories, that they became literate and were trying to get out of the village through education. And yet his brother was unable to serve militarily, but knew some German and therefore was forced to serve as the Germans as a translator. He was branded a collaborator. The sister actually ended up working for Smirch. So she was on the Soviet side, but she didn't really, apparently wasn't very enthusiastic about that, but she was part of the group purging the population on the Soviet side after the war. Maslenikov himself was kept in a, because he was a member of the party, and everyone knew this, it was quite dangerous under the occupation. And he was, so when the partisans came in, he sort of reluctantly, in his own account, joined the partisans, ended up in one of these gulags, these POW camps, and ended up as a forced worker, an Ostarbeiter in Saxony. And because of that, he survived the war, but had come into contact with the land of fascism. He faced post-war stigma for his entire life. Do I have like 5 more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to briefly say something about these POW camps. Because they were, especially in 41 and 42, outright starvation camps where POWs were taken on death marches, and the mortality rates were staggering. And in fact, the destruction of the POWs, so Maslenikov ended up in one of these camps near Bratislava, which is one of the other cities in the Smolensk region. But this, according to Christian Streit, who wrote the most significant book based on German sources, these are up to 3.3 million casualties in the course of the war, and most of them occurred in death by starvation or mistreatment or disease in the early part of the war. By March 42, approximately 2 million POWs had perished in gulags and stalags, which were officer camps. By the end of the war, 5.7 million POWs had been taken, up to 3.3 million had perished. Now, by comparison, Yitzhak Arad, who wrote the most statistically relevant book on the Holocaust on the Eastern Front, estimated that the scale of the Holocaust on Soviet territory at 2.5, 2.6 million Jewish victims, or 2.0, 2.1 million on pre-39 Soviet territory. Now, of course, Jews were a very small part of the population, so per capita, the Jews suffered far more and were a unique focus of German violence. But I raised just the sheer overall kind of scale of the POWs to show that this is a really significant atrocity that has almost never been studied. And in fact, there's not a single interpretive monograph in English. There's a few, Streit's book and a few others in German, some stuff in Russian. There's a Holocaust Museum's Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos has a volume, but of a handbook type nature. There's never been a monograph, as opposed to hundreds and hundreds of excellent books on the Holocaust. And to me, this symbolizes how extremely violent regimes don't have just one victim group. And when you actually, and I have a chapter on the synergies of violence. So when you look at all the waves of German violence, the Holocaust, the POWs, the Scorched Village campaign, the anti-partisan war, you have many of the same perpetrators, but chronologically they overlap in significant ways as well. So to get back to Maslenikov, he found himself in, and this is where I'm going to end, humiliated and without rights in my own land, as he put it. And when he was approached by a camp officer and was offered to get out of the camp if he would serve as an armed collaborator in one of the anti-partisan units. So these POW camps, they weren't genocidal in the sense that they were systematically trying to destroy people. In fact, what I found was that there's some smoking guns here in documentary evidence that starving the POWs actually was seen as a deliberate help to recruiting collaborators, because if you're starving, you will agree to anything. And he said, he faced a choice. He was promised good rations, he was promised a weapon, and everyone was jumping at the chance around him. And at that moment, he faced a choice, and he actually refused. And the reasons why he recorded in his posthumous memoirs, which were published by a tiny vanity press in the town of Mazhaisk, and 200 copies, one of which was in the Library of Congress. He writes, this is an interesting passage. I, of course, did not imagine myself to be a hero of the resistance. He was always self-deprecating. And he realized that others might use getting out of the camp to escape. He said, I'm not that person. That entails great risk. Not everyone is capable of that. But he didn't make that choice not out of just caution. He made a decision not to become a collaborator because something in the camp commandant's offer repulsed him. And his words conveyed a sense of bitterness at this kind of servile role that he was contemplating. As if it were not enough that I had ended in captivity, now I was going to voluntarily serve them. But as I said, back in Smolensk after the war, that decision only cost him dearly because he faced stigma his whole life after that. So despite all the contingency, all the structural impediments that Maslenikov faced, there were key moments of choice and agency, and of all of them, that was perhaps the most significant. Thank you.
Thank you, Misha. I think you brought all your skills to bear on this one. I look forward to reading it. We have quite a few here. So we'll be going back and forth between this audience and that audience. I'll call on them simply because I can coordinate all that. Would anyone in the room like to ask a question? Or make a comment? Yes, Brandon Schechter.
I very much enjoyed reading this book, and I very much enjoyed the state of the field that you lay out in the establishment chapters. And my question is a process question. Did you initially set out to interpret Smolensk, or were you interested in writing a book about power and Smolensk became your case study? I'm just kind of curious how you started, and then depending on which of those two, how it might have turned out differently had you gone not to power but something else, or gone to a different space. I mean, obviously, the characters are great, but
I'm happy to tell you the origin story. I had always been reading about Stalinism and Nazism, and teaching about it. So I was sort of interested in general, and in writing something about that. But Smolensk only the idea came about, I think, in 2009 when I took a course at the Holocaust Museum for professors who were starting to teach about the Holocaust. And at that conference was Father Patrick Desbois, who is now a colleague of mine at Georgetown. He was doing forensic investigations of unmarked graves. He wrote that book, The Holocaust by Bullets. And he had gone into Smolensk Oblast after many years of working in Belarus and Ukraine. And he was telling me how different the Russian Federation lands seemed to him when he went in there. And he had also done these interviews, which I ended up using in the section about the ghetto, and because they were largely non-Jewish survivors, unlike the Spielberg interviews and others. He was interviewing local Russians who were teenagers at the time and who had witnessed a lot of the violence. And so that was a very interesting source. And, Smolensk has this oversight, the first textbook that I ever read in Stephen Cohen's Soviet politics course was Hoff and Feinsod. So, to go to Smolensk and look at that was interesting to me as a kind of, as I say, it was almost like a palimpsest of the field of Soviet studies, getting each layer, uncovering each layer. Because what I found out was that the revisionists who studied Smolensk in the 70s and 80s had read Feinsod's book extremely carefully. And so there's a hidden history of the field, a meta history embedded in the endnotes of this book, if you follow them. But then, the notion, so I made my first trip in 2011, and I started looking already at the war. So the idea was to go, the Smolensk archive peters out in 37. It doesn't really cover the terror, and it certainly doesn't at all cover the occupation. So my goal was to kind of add those two elements and see what came out of it. So power emerged. I mean, the second part of your question is, I think it does sacrifice something. Like if I had been interested in studying things other than the political history, the power political dimensions, the ideology, the violence. My pre-war chapters would have looked quite a bit different. I might have studied the local intelligentsia more, the emergence of, I only was able to allude to it in those chapters. But I think every topic is both enabling, but also sacrifice something in there.
Virtual people, you have to make yourselves known if you want to ask a question. From the room? Yes.
Thank you. So I am a huge fan of this book, as you know. And I was interested in all of the decisions people are making very quickly with very poor information, but also was wondering to put it kind of crudely, whether they're getting used to this by now. In other words, we've had 1905, 1917, 1929, 1937, by 1941, are people like talking to their parents about what it was like for the previous generation to make similar sets of decisions about what's going on with confusing regimes? In other words, is this the fragility of the and the confusion of the regime change? Are people starting to build up traditions and bodies of knowledge around that? Are you seeing any evidence of that sort of thing?
The only evidence that I can see is on the Jewish population, because so much more has been written about that, including some oral histories by people like Anna Sternschus. But what they were trying to show, there was this whole notion that the Germans had been very different towards the Jewish population in World War I. And so there's this whole narrative that you often see in oral histories, that younger people attributing their decisions, especially of the older people, not to leave because of the memories of World War I. But Sternschus ultimately concludes that this may have been a kind of self-serving mythology to justify younger people who had to leave their older parents and relatives behind, which was extraordinarily traumatic. And so even then, in this more documented case, we don't really know how things, I think how rumors work is extremely important in World War II. It was important in the Civil War. There have been some books about that. I didn't have the kind of records, maybe if someone went in now trying to ascertain that as their main investigation, they might be able to establish it. But I think your question raises a bigger theoretical point, which is about agency, right, and misunderstandings, because so often when historians have talked about agency, it's in a positive sense that is associated with resistance. And I think that's, simply the way it emerged in the field was to kind of ascribe agency, as I said, dispensing it as a positive attribute for whatever group you're studying. But in fact, as I show in the whole chapter on collaboration, conformity and collaboration also involves choice. And even sometimes making no decision or deciding not to do anything is a kind of a choice. But so much of what we have to do to contextualize decision-making, which is a more neutral term than agency, right? I think decision-making is to see what kind of evidence and information was available to people at the time. And that's very tricky. But what I can show is that there were outright misunderstandings. People thought they knew the Nazis, including Menshagin, sometimes because they had experienced Stalinism, but they actually miscalculated. But then there's also a kind of, once you make such a choice, like to collaborate, it leads you down a certain path from which there is very, very difficult to swerve. So there's a kind of path dependency.
And O'Donnell?
I just love this. I could ask 1,000 questions, but I'm going to reframe what I was going to ask based on what you just said. Because I was really interested in this way that you are sort of personalizing and giving traction and therefore opening up new analytical space to this insight about past experiences and decision making under, strong authoritarianism, whatever, what we're gonna call these regimes. And I was thinking, when you were speaking about that, about Gross and the layered experiences of the Soviet and then Nazi and then Soviet regimes. And I was wondering if you might speak a minute or two just about the way that you engage or see or work alongside that argument. But then just now, one of the things that was so interesting to me about what you were saying was about the way you said it is past choices bias future decisions. And for some reason, I just had this question about if you saw this at all happening, or I suppose it's hard because of the sources and the recollections. Do you have any sense of how people were thinking about the future, or if they were thinking about it at all in this space of choiceless choices or really degraded agency connected to the severity of the circumstances?
Yes, thank you. So Jan Gross was a big inspiration for the book, and not just the book Neighbors, which does show the double occupation and the decisions made under one regime, which might have been to help the Soviets, might have made people be even more zealous towards helping the Germans when they came in, because you wanted to get rid of that past association. And so it doesn't necessarily, it's maybe a little counterintuitive, but that was a dynamic that he showed in Neighbors. And I think there was, in some cases, a similar dynamic when people tried to, say, expose the partisans in the Smolensk region, when the partisan movement got off the ground, to exculpate their pasts in a similar way. But more broadly, that book opened up the whole study of the occupation for a whole subsequent generation of researchers, not so much on the Russian Federation areas that I was studying, but on the West, what we used to call the Western borderlands, Belarus and further west. But for me also, the first book, Revolution from Abroad, was actually quite crucial, because it showed what was the phrase that Jan Gross used? He talked about the privatization of power, which I thought was not the greatest word for the Soviet Union to talk about privatization, but the dynamic that I discussed about appropriation at a local level, Gross was the one who first started me thinking about that. And this other book in Holocaust studies by Yevgeny Finkel about ghettos and choices the horrible choices that ghetto leaders had to face, made me start thinking about issues of that nature, of compelled or tragic agency. But your second part of your question is like, what were people thinking about the future? And I think here we have to make a big distinction in the rural and the urban population. But one thing that Smolensk was so fascinating was that the front lines were not only close, but they were unstable. So in 42, there was a Red Army advance that got repelled. The partisans in 42 made significant, at one point in 42, they had almost 30 to 40% of the entire territory of Smolensk region they reestablished Soviet power, far from Moscow and without Stalin. So Stalinism without Stalin is what I call the chapter, I think, or the phenomenon in the chapter, because they created these kind of Soviet communities in the midst of war, and then they were repulsed by a major German operation. So it's not unlike places further west where there were 3 or even 4 years of occupation and then a regime change. The fortunes of war were shifting for local populations. And what you see in the sources is that popular attitudes, shift almost like a weather vane, depending on who they think is going to win the war. Now, that may be an oversimplification, but this is what the German and the Soviet sources also wrote about. And so I just lay it out there as something that, the rural population, some of them, minority, bet on one of the two regimes. Some villages supported the Germans, others supported the partisans. But it was more complicated than that, because they could shift and elders hedged their bets, and they did various things to hedge their bets. But in one Soviet source, I found that, something large, they estimated those two sides were like maybe 20% of each, and then 60% were kind of in the middle, what they call the swamp, right? And they were shifting and opportunistic. And maybe that's a little bit too utilitarian, but these are how the sources themselves view it. In terms of, there's a significant theme of Russian national, I won't say nationalism under occupation, and the Vlasov movement, various Germans who wanted to have a different type of occupation regime, which gives some political future, like a protectorate to those Russian areas that Hitler and the top leadership in Nazi Germany never allowed. And this was kind of happening on both sides, but they clearly were anti-Stalinist, anti-communist, and envisioned some future under the Reich. And that is, I think, an interesting point, because it was both the local Russian notables in the urban areas and elements of the Wehrmacht and the Vlasov's handlers who were trying to make this happen, but it never did.
No, thank you. This was really a fantastic talk. I have a question about the general Soviet Nazi framework, which is, a fairly logic framework, and at the same time, a lot there's a very rich historiography on the subject, and I'm just wondering, do you enter into any polemics, with Snyder or your predecessors on that topic, or do you have methodological questions on comparative versus entangled histories?
Well, so I tried not to do comparative history. I tried to juxtapose, right? And I tried to avoid sort of closing the moral ledger by engaging in the lesser evil debate, which I don't think is very productive for scholarship, even if I might have my personal opinions about things, which I do, and but I don't think that it really serves that much purpose. But some people do. I mean, I've gotten some real pushback. Some people want to have. I've already been sort of called to task for not using totalitarianism, and I've been called to task for not openly sort of declaring that the Germans were much, much worse. And so there's a cost. There's a cost to this stance that I've taken, and you'll be seeing there's certain debates now being sparked, which I've been asked to write response to, like in the spring 26 issue of Slavic Review. There'll be some critiques that I will respond to. But what I said there was that, for after many, many years of kind of both thinking and teaching and writing about these two, fascism and communism, I've realized that there's a kind of tension between identifying certain underlying commonalities between, these two regimes of right and left. For example, dehumanization happens very much in the collectivization and, under the fascism. And in 31, I have this episode where, some of the collectivizers are calling kulaks a breed, which is a kind of a racial term. They're saying that they're making the kulaks dance in front of the church in 41, like the Nazis did it to Jews in 41, humiliating them by making them dance in front of churches they're about to dynamite. And also some of the collectivizers saying, we will make soap out of the kulaks. Now, does this mean that I think that the kulaks are the equivalent of the Jews? No. Obviously, the Jews were a special position in Nazi violence and ideology, but it does show that a profound dehumanization can occur among the perpetrators in both regimes, and that I show that some survivors of decollectivization saw those parallels, and also that 41 cannot be understood without reference to 31. So both eras, you just can't understand the world population without understanding what happened a decade before. So that doesn't mean, so there are certain underlying, let's say, common denominators that one could point to, but then there's a whole range of big and small specific differences. And I think that's one of the major things I just want to lay out there.
Let me follow up on this. Jake, you had a question, right?
Yeah,
If I follow up on this,
Yeah,
and then
of course.
so, just to open my observation question, take it as you like, right? But I mean, is there a difference between dehumanizing because you have a high expectation of humanity of everybody, a Marxist view, or dehumanization because you think your victims never could be human, right? And I wonder if there's a difference here. And what I mean in part is this, that you have a territory there where you have a pretty longish period with the regime that comes in 17 onward after the end of the Civil War in order to reformat an entire population, right? And you know the writings I'm talking about. You know, we're not here just to have a new ruler. We're here to actually transform every single one of you, right? And because we believe so deeply and radically in the malleability of every human being. Improvability, take it as you will, right? And they've had time to do this, right? To some extent, the purges being the most recent, right? So then comes a regime, which is, best I can still tell the common wisdom, it's based on race, right? And not everybody is fully human. Not everybody is human at all. And partly for this reason, and partly because they're not there for very long, don't really have this chance to impose themselves on the population or to implicate themselves in the population, partly because of time, but partly also because of their ideology, which assumes that the conquered population, all of them, are subhuman, right? So they don't want them involved in government, right? So, I mean, this is partly a question, partly an observation, right? Which then brings me to the final thing, which is what we were talking about recently, you and I, about, different kinds of violence, right? And we have in mind a certain kind of historiography which says, well, look, I'll explain this to you in just a minute. That, yes, unit by unit, a lot of people died under both regimes, but one of them was done in the name of class and the other was done in the name of race.
Yes.
Which is a distinction, but I don't know if it's a difference, right?
Well, yes, so you raised some profound issues, and I'll just make a couple of points in response. One is that in general, yes, there are the big thrust of violence. You can say race versus class. You can say the revolutionary energies were external towards domination, conquest, and in the sense of war, because the Nazi revolution, the soldier was the new man. And so these martial masculinity was at the core of that revolutionary energy. Whereas, class has different implications, and it's well known, the Gulag was not extermination camps, and the Soviets don't commit genocide in the sense of systematic destruction. But, the latest work on the Gulag shows that the mortality rates were much higher than we knew about before, because many people were released on the verge of death. So, I do think that there ultimately is a difference in the type of violence. Let's say that the Nazis had won the war and were able to, create their racial order on a global scale. Now, there's actually a debate among specialists. Would they have moderated themselves, as in the man in the high castle scenario, right? Or would they have continued to? I think there's quite a good chance that they would have ended up destroying far more people than they could in the 12 years that they were in power versus the much longer period of Stalinism. But that's a counterfactual that we will never know. And what we do know, and I'll just say 2 points, is that first of all, these regimes come in stages, right? So it depends what we're comparing. If you compare late Stalinism, 45 to 53, it's very different than comparing pre-war Stalinism of the 1930s. So you immediately run into problems of periodization. And secondly, when you really start to look at race versus class, you find out, and this is where some of the best literature on fascism comes in, that it's not all about race. There are plenty of exceptions. And even the Nazis are writing about the Jewish spirit, the Geist, right, which is a psychological phenomenon, like acting Jewish. And it becomes a mental and a psychological and a cultural construction rather. And there's a lot written on Nazi racial science versus the actual contingent and flexible policies of the regime, which did make lots of exceptions on the ground, also depending on economic considerations and so on. I actually like Michael Mann's older piece about regimes of permanent revolution, and that these were regimes that only made temporary compromises, but still those compromises were made. And then class can, yeah, you'd think that everyone could potentially be re-educated, but it turns out not everyone interprets it that way. And class and culture can become almost like a nature or a, a kind of essentialized category. So what you say about dehumanization is interesting. And I had a colleague who read my manuscript who said, don't use the word dehumanization because humans can be awful towards their fellow humans, and that takes away from that notion. But when you see pictures of beasts and notions of breeds, to me, I wanted to use it for that reason, to call attention that both regimes could essentialize the enemy and see it in profoundly conspiratorial terms as well. So I didn't answer your question, but we'd have to write a whole book about that.
Jake Robertson, our most recent colleague at Tisch.
Yeah, thanks. Hi. Yeah, this is great. Yanni already sort of teed this all up, but I was really interested in the broader question of soft power, and particularly I'm a cultural historian, so I was interested in the obviously we're talking about a lot of wide-scale destruction and violence applied to populations, but yeah, what were there any narratives, any positivist or constructive narratives that were, I know about the Stalinist ones that were being kind of introduced in that period, in the pre-war period, but were the occupiers creating any sort of narrative of a future with a culture and things like that? So that's one question. And then the really zoomed in question is, you mentioned something, quoting Minshagin, saying that I was a cultured person, and so I can't remember what he didn't do. Maybe he didn't collaborate in a certain way.
Well, he wasn't opportunity, he saw
He
the
wasn't
opportunistic.
Got it. So I was curious about that as a sort of legacy of Kulturlist. Was he using the term Kulturny, and then what did he mean by that? And, yeah.
I've written a whole article about Kulturlist versus
Okay.
Kultur.
Yeah.
And so, these terms were key words and they have very different pedigrees.
Yeah.
And for Madzuk, actually, Kulturlist was the prism through which she judged the Germans. They were barbaric. It was almost like, because in the late Stalinist and post-Stalin period, it becomes almost a cliche that you're uncultured. But in the 30s and the war, it actually assumed meaning over this debate over barbarism versus civilization.
Yeah.
And that, the mass rapes that Madzuk and the sexual violence were a sign that all their pretensions of being a higher culture were just, absurd because they were the ones who were uncultured. And so it sounds into our ears like it does, but it had really great weight for her and the others of that generation as an explanatory factor. So it was a marker of the superiority of Stalinist civilization.
Mhm.
And the irony was for her, and I realize your question is about Menshagin, but still, is that everything she associated with that higher culture, which was the fact that women had these opportunities, the gender order, but also that there was a certain a lack of anti-Semitism, a lack of racial categories, all the things associated with socialism. This was kind of shifting under her feet because exemplified by the fact that some of the people who really became members of this so-called Ruskaya Partia, the Shchelepincy, the far-right nationalistic wing of the Communist Party is very active in the Komsomol during the war. And so there's a lot of ironies there because what she associated with being socialist and Soviet was actually shifting.
Yeah.
But in terms of Menshagin so I think that, first of all, he was a religious believer. And he was caught several times going to church, and this was a factor in his biography. He was Orthodox, and he was not personally anti-Semitic. And we have a lot of sources. He was in the legal field. He had people who were his colleagues. And he had worked as an archivist in the Red Army in the 1920s, so that actually saved him from being, despite the fact that he was denounced for going to church. But there is some evidence that he thought that the Stalin constitution was a real turn to the better, and that he became so disillusioned under the terror precisely because he had raised a toast to Stalin in 1936, and he felt betrayed by this. So there are some, but in terms of I do think that he felt that Russia, the Russian territories under a German Reich had a future that was different than what actually the Germans were kind of propagating, that this would be an agrarian sort of area for resettlement for the Reich. He didn't really, because the Germans concealed all of that in their propaganda. And they played on this notion of Germany being a benevolent kind of Western European power, that life would be so much better. And ironically, because there was a Russian language press, pro-German newspapers, publications, all sorts of things. And many of those people who were recruited from these gulags to serve as, as journalists, they had trained under Stalinism. And so there's a weird similarity in the visions of the industrial future that you see in the Russian language press. And so, it's a very significant phenomenon that the real German war aims and discussions, and there were differences among them too, because someone like Alfred Rosenberg, who was head of the occupied territories, but then sidelined, had a different vision for, at least in terms of wartime outreach to hearts and minds to win the war than Goebbels or Goering or Hitler. So, but by and large, the fact that there were Russian propagandists who are kind of making a weird case for the future of these occupied Russian territories, but combining in very interesting ways some Soviet tropes with some German ones, I think, has a largely overlooked phenomenon.
The virtual world has no agency. That's right. But you want to know why you're being interrupted all the time? So
Go ahead. You can
so if you have anything connected with NYU's embrace, hardware, software, and all that, then you get these notifications. We have to update your software so as that our IT people and whoever else can see us at a distance and fix our computers, right?
Yeah, I'm
So
so
this is-
sorry about that. We had told the computer to update overnight and for some reason it
You
didn't
know how long it
work.
lasted for me?
And we got
3 weeks.
IT to shut it off. but
It's
then
not your fault.
didn't.
It lasted for 3 weeks for me.
So
But I
sorry
feel better
about
because I feel the protective grasp of NYU. Send me anywhere in the world. I looked into my computer and that makes me feel special.
Well, the show must go on. So thank you all very much.
Oh. That was good.